For centuries, European battlefields were ruled by one terrifying figure, the knight. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the tanks of their age, men encased in steel, mounted on warhorses bred and trained for combat, and drilled in the craft of killing from the time they could walk. Quick question before we go further. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how many places the story of knights can reach. To face a knight was to face a walking fortress. It was said that a single knight could hold off 10 common footmen, and when they charged, entire lines of infantry could crumble like dry twigs. Their lances could impale multiple enemies in one thrust, and their sheer presence was enough to send poorly armed peasants scattering in panic. But here's the twist no nobleman expected. When people are pushed to the breaking point, they adapt. Desperation sparks creativity, and oppression can turn the powerless into something far more dangerous. United. Life for a medieval peasant was not just hard. It was soul-crushing. They were bound to the soil like cattle, working dawn to dusk simply to keep breathing. They lived under the crushing weight of taxes demanded by lords who saw them as little more than a resource to be used. They watched their children die from illnesses that today would be cured with a pill. Their homes were mud huts shared with livestock, and each poor harvest meant hunger and despair. When a person has nothing left to lose, they become unpredictable and often unstoppable. The first cracks in knightly dominance appeared not on some grand royal battlefield, but in the lowlands of Flanders. In the early 1300s, Count Louis of Nevers pushed his people too far. His endless taxes and loyalty to France threatened to choke his subjects' livelihoods. By October 1323, the pressure boiled over. What began as scattered rural unrest quickly ignited into something no one could have imagined. A coordinated peasant uprising that would grip Flanders for nearly half a decade. At the heart of this rebellion stood an unlikely leader, Nicholas Zannekin, a wealthy farmer who understood something most rebels didn't. Anger alone wasn't enough to win against trained killers in steel. He turned that anger into strategy, shaping angry mobs into disciplined militia. Under his command, these rebels didn't just torch villages and vanish. They captured cities, Newport, Vern, and even Bruges, and held them. They governed. They administered justice. They showed the world that common people, once written off as expendable, could fight, win, and even rule. But their ultimate trial came not in the shadows, but in the open field. On July 11, 1302, at a place forever remembered as the Battle of the Golden Spurs, everything came to a head. King Philip IV of France marched to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force, 8,000 men, including 2,500 of the finest armored knights and men-at-arms, the very definition of medieval military power. Facing them were 9,400 Flemish townsfolk, artisans, craftsmen, merchants, and farmers, many of whom had never stood in a real battle before. On paper, it was a slaughter waiting to happen. The French lined up in perfect order, 10 tight formations, each with 250 armored cavalry ready to ride down the rebels. Their plan was textbook: soften the enemy with a storm of crossbow bolts, and then unleash the cavalry in a devastating wave that would smash the peasant line and sweep the field clean. It had worked countless times before, and why wouldn't it work now? But the Flemish were no fools. They knew they couldn't outfight knights head-on, so they outthought them. They chose their battlefield with precision: low, marshy ground broken by streams and ditches, land where heavy horses would struggle, and they carried a weapon of their own making. The Godendag, a brutal wooden staff tipped with an iron spike, designed for one deadly purpose: dragging knights off their mounts and finishing them on the ground. It was a peasant's answer to steel and chivalry. When the battle began, the script seemed to follow the old rules. French crossbowmen pushed back Flemish missile troops, and infantry began to pry open the rebel lines. Victory seemed close enough to taste, but then arrogance intervened. Count Robert II of Artois, leading the French, pulled back his infantry. Why? Because for him and the nobility, victory could only be claimed by knights. To let common soldiers break the enemy would be dishonorable. This single decision changed history. The cavalry charged. Across the marsh they thundered, but instead of cutting through like a blade, they bogged down. Horses slipped, formations shattered. What should have been an unstoppable force dissolved into scattered knots of struggling men. And then the peasants did something no knight expected. They stood their ground. They didn't run. They surged forward, surrounding isolated riders. One knight might find himself facing 10 men at once, each with a weapon made to slip into the gaps of his shining armor. The hunters had become the hunted. What came next didn't just win a battle. It shattered the illusion of knightly invincibility for good. The Flemish weapon known as the Godendag, iron spikes on stout wooden shafts, more than lived up to its grim name that day. Imagine the scene. Proud French nobles, glittering in steel and gold, charging forward only to be ripped from their horses like toppled statues. The thunder of hooves turned to chaos. The clash of steel turned to screams. Expensive armor, once the ultimate symbol of dominance, became coffins as Flemish fighters swarmed, prying open visors, dragging knights down into the mud. For 3 relentless, bloody hours, the unthinkable happened. By the time the last cries faded, the flower of French chivalry lay broken. More than 70 high-born lords were dead, their golden spurs, symbols of nobility and honor, ripped from their boots and collected like grim trophies. By the end, nearly 500 pairs were counted, each one representing a man who would never again terrorize common fields or villages. Guy of Nemours, commanding the Flemish forces, gave no quarter. His order was chillingly simple. Anyone wearing golden spurs dies. No ransoms, no negotiations, no special treatment for titles or bloodlines. For the first time, noble blood held no more value than the sweat-stained hands of the men who tilled the soil. Panic consumed the French ranks. The surviving knights, once feared like gods of war, fled, leaving behind foot soldiers to be cut down by the very peasants they had long dismissed as nothing more than tools. The shockwaves were immediate and profound. Word of this victory tore across Europe like wildfire. Royal courts trembled. Noble households whispered of rebellion. If Flemish weavers and farmers could break the pride of France's finest, what was stopping common people everywhere? The entire premise of feudal society, that nobility equaled superiority, that birth made warriors, cracked that afternoon under the weight of muddy boots and peasant pikes. But the story didn't end on that field. The lesson was too important to fade. Those farmers had discovered something that terrified the ruling class. Discipline and organization could match, and even defeat, training and wealth. Across Europe, others were watching and learning. A Bohemian leader named Jan Žižka would take these ideas and forge them into something even more fearsome. Žižka understood why previous uprisings failed. They were mobs, furious but unstructured. He changed that. His Hussite army ran like a machine. Orders were law, disobedience meant death. He trained peasants not just to fight, but to move quickly, to strike where the enemy was weakest. And he armed them not with dreams of knighthood, but with brutal practicality. Grain flails became spiked maces, pitchforks were reforged into pikes that could puncture steel. And then came the true innovation, the war wagon. These wagons were rolling fortresses, mobile barricades bristling with weapons. With them, Žižka turned farmland into battlefields and knights into casualties. Cavalry charges, once the terror of Europe, slammed helplessly against walls of wood and iron. This new thinking spread like a spark on dry grass. England would feel it in 1381 when thousands of peasants marched on London, seizing the Tower and executing the Archbishop of Canterbury. Though crushed, that rebellion marked the end of any serious attempt to fully reimpose serfdom in England. The idea was planted. Fear could no longer keep the masses silent. For generations, knights had been painted as holy warriors, chosen by God, unchallengeable in battle. That myth was the glue of feudalism. The Flemish shattered it. Chronicles from the time speak of panic among the nobility, of villages torched in blind retaliation. Chronicler Jean Froissart described nobles lashing out brutally, trying to stitch back together the old fear. But it was too late. The peasants had seen the truth. Knights could fall. They could bleed. They could die like anyone else. And here's the irony. Knights were investments. Each one was years of training, armor worth a fortune, a warhorse that cost more than entire peasant families earned in a lifetime. And yet, These glittering symbols of wealth and power were being destroyed by men with farm tools and anger sharpened into steel. War itself began to change. No longer could titles guarantee victory. At Crécy and Agincourt, English longbowmen would cut down French cavalry by the hundreds, the arrow replacing the sword. The knight's time was passing, replaced by professional armies and deadly efficiency. But here's the thing, this wasn't just a shift in warfare. It was a social earthquake. The victories at Courtrai, the fearless defiance of the Hussites, the marches that shook London to its core, they all carried the same message. Ordinary people could fight, could organize, could lead. The old feudal order, where birth decided power, started to fracture. And those golden spurs, taken from fallen knights, weren't just trophies. They were proof that unity could topple privilege. Think about it. Those Flemish peasants, once dismissed as nobodies trudging through muddy fields, would go on to build cities, trading networks, and fortunes that rivaled the wealth of kings. They proved that true strength doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes, it grows from the soil beneath your feet. So the next time you hear a tale of underdogs facing overwhelming odds, picture those farmers, covered in mud, staring down glittering cavalry with nothing but pikes, grit, and an unbreakable will. They could have run, they could have surrendered, but they didn't. They stood their ground. And in that moment, they didn't just win a battle, they cracked the very foundations of the medieval world. Now here's a question for you. If you had to fight, would you rather stand shoulder to shoulder with the farmers or charge in with the knights? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story of courage and defiance grabbed you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths, where forgotten battles, lost voices, and game-changing moments come alive. Stay tuned, because the next story might just change the way you see history forever.